Happy Easter, friends. With the ULT DC Lodge closed due to the coronavirus epidemic, we are continuing to work from home. Last week, we started a series of talks on HPB's seminal presentation of psychic and noetic action. The focus last Sunday was on free will. Today's focus will be on the mind. The Washington, D.C. United Lodge of Theosophists, as do our sister ULTs around the world, follow the ULT declaration, which is, the policy of this lodge is independent devotion to the cause of Theosophy, without professing attachment to any theosophical organization. It is loyal to the great founders of the theosophical movement, but does not concern itself with dissensions or differences of individual opinion. The work it has on hand and the end it keeps in view are too absorbing and too lofty to leave it the time or inclination to take part in side issues. That work and that end is the dissemination of the fundamental principles of the philosophy of Theosophy and the exemplification and practice of those principles through a truer realization of the self, a profounder conviction of universal brotherhood. It holds that the unassailable basis for union among Theosophists, wherever and however situated, is similarity of aim, purpose, and teaching, and therefore has neither constitution, bylaws, nor officers, the sole bond between its associates being that basis. And it aims to disseminate this idea among Theosophists in the furtherance of unity. It regards as Theosophists all who are engaged in the true service of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, condition, or organization. And it welcomes to its association all those who are in accord with its declared purposes and who desire to fit themselves by study and otherwise to be the better able to help and teach others. The true Theosophist belongs to no cult or sect, yet belongs to each and all. The following is a form signed by associates of the United Lodge of Theosophists who choose to sign it. Being in sympathy with the purposes of this lodge as set forth in its declaration, I hereby record my desire to be enrolled as an associate, it being understood that such association calls for no obligation on my part other than which I myself determine. Today's reading comes from the Dhammapada, chapter 3, titled Mind. 1. Just as a fletcher makes straight his arrow, the wise man makes straight his crooked thinking. This is difficult to guard. This is hard to restrain. 2. Like unto a fish snatched from its watery home and cast on land, the mind trembles and quivers, leaving the dominion of Mara. 3. Thinking is difficult to discipline. Mind is flighty, alighting where it listeth. Good is to tame it. The tame mind is the bearer of happiness. 4. Let a wise man watch his thinking. The mind moves with extreme subtlety and is not noticed. It seizes whatever it desires. To watch the mind is conducive to happiness. 5. He who controls his mind escapes the bondage of Mara. The mind is incorporeal, moves alone, travels far, and rests in the cave of the heart. 6. Wisdom fills not the unsteady mind of the man of ruffled serenity. He is ignorant of the true teaching. 7. Fear there is not for him those whose mind is not burning with desires, and which, having risen above likes and dislikes, is serene. He is awakened. 8. Looking upon his body to be fragile as an earthen jar, valuing his mind as a firm fortress, let a man fight Mara with the sword of wisdom. Let him guard what he has gained, but let him fight on. 9. Ere long, alas, will this body lie on earth, cast aside, bereft of consciousness, unless useless as a burnt faggot. 10. Whatever an enemy may do to an enemy, whatever a hater may do to a hater, a wrongly directed mind will do to us greater harm. 11. Not a mother nor a father, not any kindred can do much. A well-directed mind does us greater service. And now for today's talk.
Last week we had talked about free will, and that it is extremely important to understand what it is, because it correlates to the higher mind. We had left it at a point where we were talking about a statement from Professor Ladd. We'll continue just a little bit further on to make sure that the definitions that we had talked about are clear. He says, we conclude then from the previous considerations, the subject of all the states of consciousness is a real unit being called mind, which is of non-material nature and acts and develops according to laws of its own, but is especially correlated with certain material molecules and masses forming substance of the brain. Elements of physiological psychology is where this statement taken from. The mind is manas, or as it is discussed, its lower reflection, which whenever it disconnects itself from kama, for the time being, it becomes the guide of the highest mental faculties and is the organ of the free will in physical man. Therefore, the assumption of the newest psychophysiology is uncalled for. Psychic action is found subject to the general and immutable laws of motion. Therefore, there is no free will in man. And the analytical method of exact science is applied for its demonstration. The philosophical doctrine of the soul and its separate existence has nothing to do with this physiological question, but its proof rests on a species totally different from it. Let us examine the analytical method a little bit to show that it is not correct in its application. The statement is, starting from the standpoint of this analytical method, one would have an equal right to deny every phenomenon in nature from first to last. For do not sound, light, heat, and electricity, like all other chemical processes, wherein all the peculiarities of the given elements disappear, leaving behind them only the vibrations of molecules? But does it necessarily follow that heat, light, electricity are but illusions instead of actual manifestations of the peculiarities of our real world? Such peculiarities are not, of course, to be found in compound elements, simply because we cannot expect that a part should contain from first to last the properties of the whole. Why should we say of a chemist who, having decomposed water into its compounds, hydrogen and oxygen, without finding in them the special characteristics of water, would maintain that such did not exist at all, or that it could not be found in water? And does not the author, just in this way, when he denies the existence of free will or self-spontaneity in men, on the grounds that this instinctive faculty of the highest psychic activity is absent from those compound elements which he has analyzed? When we look at a ruined building, we do not expect the brick, wood, or the iron that was used in its construction to preserve the smallest trace of the architecture of that building. Anyway, this is perhaps in the hands of a chemist, but in those of a psychometer, it shows that the subjective or psychic worlds preserve the architecture intact. The genesis of sound has to be traced back to same motion, and the same correlation of forces is at play during the phenomenon as in the case of every other manifestation. So, if the physicist then, who decomposes sound into its compound element of vibrations and fails to find in them any harmony or special melody, deny the existence of the latter, harmony. And does this prove that the analytical method, having to deal with exclusively with the elements and their vibration, fails to find in them any harmony or special melody? Should we then deny the existence of the latter? The analytical method, having to deal exclusively with the elements and nothing to do with their combinations, leads the physicist to talk about motion, vibration, losing the sight of the harmony produced by certain combinations of that motion, of the harmony of the vibrations. he forgets, in short, or rather purposely ignores the fact that, though like all other phenomena on the material plane, psychic manifestations must be related in their final analysis to a world of vibration, sound being the substratum of universal akasha. Yet, in their origin, they belong to a different and higher world of harmony. The universal process of becoming has been almost personified and deified so as to make it the true ground of all finite and concrete existence. The attempt is made to refer all the so-called development of the mind to the evolution of the substance of the brain under purely physical and mechanical causes. This attempt then denies that any real unit being called the mind needs to be assumed as undergoing a process of development according to laws of its own. On the other hand, all attempts to account for the orderly increase in complexity and comprehensiveness of the mental phenomena by tracing the physical evolution of the brain are wholly unsatisfactory to many minds. It was at that time, and the same issues are relevant today. On the whole, the history of each individual's experiences is such as requires the assumption that a real unit being, a mind, is undergoing a process of development in relation to the changing condition or evolution of the brain, yet in accordance with nature and laws of its own. Now, this statement that science approaches is an occult philosophy. Further on, we discussed the special force not being needed for this activity. And HPV also states that this would be an absurdity if such a claim was to be put forward. But then, creating and guiding, between these two, there's a difference. And guiding implies in no way any creation of the energy of motion, or indeed any special energy. Psychic mind, in contradistinction to monastic or noetic mind, only transforms this energy of the unit being according to a nature and laws of its own. The unit being creates nothing, but only causes a natural correlation in accordance with both the physical laws and laws of its own. Having to use the force, it guides its direction, choosing the paths along which it will proceed, and is stimulating it into action. And as its activity is sui generis and independent, it carries this energy from this world, our world of disharmony, into its own sphere of harmony. Were it not independent, it could not do so. As it is, the freedom of man's will is beyond doubt or cavil. Therefore, as already stated, there is no question of creation of this motion or force, but only simply its guidance. If we look at a sailor at the wheel, that is in control of that vessel, does he create the steam in the engine? Of course not. But does he not direct that vessel? So, the fallacies of psychophysiologists as the last word of science cannot furnish any proof from these discussions that free will is a hallucination. This is a very animalistic idea, and as far as scientific and logical discussion, besides being illogical, actually, we can quote from Kathopanishad this metaphor. It's beautiful as well as it is descriptive. It says, the senses are the horses, body is the chariot, mind, in this case we're talking about kamamanas, is the reins, and the intellect or free will is the charioteer. Of course, this tells us that there is science, and actually more exact science in the Upanishads composed thousands of years ago than psychophysiology put together, and with psychobiology. Now, what is the difference between psychic and noetic mental functions, and noetic and monastic being same in this discussion? We have to say that it is also not recognized by official science. To this day, official science is just doing its experiment on the physical plane and does not accept the propositions that were put forward in these books by HPB that brought it from her masters, of course. In theosophical understanding, psychic and psychism are quite different. Theosophy rejects any hazy conception of these terms, whereas the general public only kind of understands that psychic and psychological in some ways refer to the human soul. But today, some metaphysicians have wisely disconnected the mind, which is puma, from the soul, which is psyche. The one being the rational, the spiritual part, the other, psyche, the living principle in man, the breath that animates him, from anima, the soul. Yes, if this is so, how in the case it is stated at that time, can we refuse souls to animals? This discussion went on for over 130 years. Only in 2019, Pope Francis granted souls to the animals from the religious perspective, but this was given to us in 1890. It is stated that the animals are no less than men because they are informed with the same principle of sentient life, the nephesh of the second chapter of Genesis. The soul is by no means the mind, nor can an idiot bereft of the mind be called a soulless being. So, the physiologists describe the human soul in its relations to senses and appetites, desires and passions, common to man and the brute, and then endow it with godlike intellect, with the spiritual and rational faculties, which can take their source but in a supersensible world. So this is to throw forever the veil of an impenetrable mystery over the subject of the mind. Yet in modern science, psychology and psychism relate only to conditions of the nervous system, mental phenomena being traced solely to a molecular action. The higher, noetic character of the mind is entirely ignored and even rejected as a superstition by both physiologists and psychologists. Psychology, in fact, has become a synonym for the science of psychiatry. But the students of Theosophy, being compelled to differ from all these, have adopted the doctrine of the time-honored philosophies that come from the East. In the next section, wisdom and knowledge is kind of synonymous, and in order to understand that, we are recommended that we go to Lucifer, which was a mode of giving to the world at that time by HPB certain seminal articles which are very relevant to our subject even today. One of them is called The Dual Aspect of Wisdom, and this is quoted from St. James in his 3rd epistle. He referring to the devilish terrestrial wisdom and wisdom from the above. And again, in another editorial called The Cosmic Mind, the ancient Hindus endow every cell in the human body with consciousness, giving each the name of a god or a goddess. Speaking of atoms in the name of science and philosophy, Professor Ladd calls them supersensible beings. And occultism regards every atom as an independent entity and every cell as a unit, conscious unit. It explains that no sooner such atoms group to form cells than the latter become endowed with consciousness, each of its own kind, and with free will to act within the limits of law. Nor are we entirely deprived of scientific evidence for such statements as the above. One of the names of Brahma is Anu, or atom. And Ladd states, every organ indeed, every area and every limit of the nervous system has its own memory. So the seat of memory then is neither here nor there, but everywhere throughout the human body. To locate its organ in the brain is to limit and dwarf the universal mind and its countless rays called Manasaputras, which inform every rational mortal. If you have any questions, please submit them and we will try to answer them. Thank you.